Everything possible to protect them from this threat.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to follow the honourable gentleman from Plymouth. Although I don't agree with the position he puts forward, I think he's put it very, very clearly and passionately, and I thank him for it and thank the armed forces for the work that they do. But having said that, Mr. Speaker, I share the horror and revulsion at recent atrocities in Paris, Beirut, Syria itself and elsewhere. Yet I have still to hear convincing evidence to suggest that UK bombing ISIS targets in Syria is likely to increase our security here in Britain or help bring about a lasting peace in the region. To the contrary, the evidence appears to suggest it would make matters worse, and that's what I want to highlight in the few minutes that I have. Because if we're interested in evidence, a good place to start might be to examine the effect of the US-led bombing campaign so far, to explore whether it's been successful and if our contribution would make a real difference. From what I've seen, the sustained bombings to date have not done much to push Daesh into retreat. According to the latest figures from the US Department of Defense, US-led forces have flown some 57,000 sorties while completing 8,300 airstrikes over a 17-month period. But they have relatively little to show for it. Because while the air war has so far killed an estimated 20,000 ISIS supporters, the number of fighters ISIS can still deploy, between 20 to 30,000, remains unchanged. Moreover, there are very real dangers that the airstrikes on Syria have become increasingly Western-driven. All four of the Middle Eastern states previously involved, Jordan, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have now withdrawn. Now that risks feeding the Daesh propaganda, in which it presents itself as the true guardian of Islam under attack from the Crusader West. Now that message, although utterly pernicious and wrong, is precisely being reinforced by Western bombings, with every indication that the attacks are an incredibly effective recruiting sergeant. Again, according to US intelligence sources, in September of last year, there were 15,000 recruits who were reported to have joined Daesh from 80 countries. A year later, that figure has risen to 30,000 recruits from 100 countries. And I've had no reassurance that Western military action wouldn't simply drive more recruits. Nor have I heard evidence to contradict the conclusion of the Foreign Affairs Committee report itself on military challenges, which very clearly states, and I quote, "Our witnesses did not consider that extending airstrikes into Syria would have anything other than a marginal effect." Indeed, as others have pointed out, far from the issue being a lack of Allied aircraft above Syria, the real problem is actually a shortage of viable targets on the ground. Now, the dangers are being compounded by ISIS's deeply cruel use of human shields, which will both make targeting them more difficult and again add to the civilian death toll. There's much talk of focusing on Raqqa, but in reality, according to recent exiles, many in the ISIS leadership have already gone to ground in places like Mosul. And they suggest that in a city like Mosul of 1.5 million people and perhaps 150,000 ISIS terrorists, if you wanted to get rid of ISIS in Mosul, you'd literally have to flatten the entire city. Now, Mr. Speaker, those of us who are sceptical about the use of airstrikes are often accused of saying we don't want anything to happen, we want inaction. But I would want to say that nothing could be further from the truth. The government can and should be playing a role in brokering peace and stability in the region. The Prime Minister could be redoubling his commendable efforts today to find a diplomatic solution. The civil war is inextricably linked to the rise of ISIS in Syria, as the Foreign Affairs Committee report repeatedly emphasised. ISIS flourishes where chaos reigns, so renewed efforts is absolutely needed to end the Syrian civil war.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for allowing me to intervene. Is the Honourable Lady inviting the House to ignore completely the UN Security Council Resolution 2249?
That resolution calls on us to use all means, and I want to make sure that we are using all of the means short of military action. I don't believe that we are doing that, and I don't believe we should be using military action unless the evidence was there that it was going to make things better. On the opposite side of the House, there's some kind of laughter at the idea that we might want to not use military action if we don't have the evidence that it's going to work. One of the reasons I don't want to use military action is that there are no ground forces on the ground. We have heard again and again that airstrikes will not work without the ground forces, and yet when asked to suggest where these ground forces are going to come from, they are mythical. They are these bogus battalions, as the Honourable Member, who is the Chair of the Defence Committee, set out. So let us not suggest that those of us who don't think that there is an instant military action to this that will be the answer now are not just as committed to seeing an end to ISIS as those on the other side of the House who do seem to think there's a military answer. All of us are committed to getting rid of ISIS. Some of us are more committed than others to looking at the full range of measures in front of us and looking at the evidence that suggests that the bombing to date has not been successful. Now, Mr. Speaker, I was talking about the other measures that I would like to see taken forward. I've talked about the diplomatic efforts building on the Vienna peace talks. That diplomatic effort must also extend to Iraq, where the Abadi government must be encouraged to reach out to the neglected Sunni minority, especially in those parts of the country where ISIS is recruiting. I want to ask as well, why are we not applying some sanctions to places like Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states who've turned a blind eye and allowed the flow of finance to ISIS and potentially to other terrorist groups? Why are we still selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which then get used in a vicious and destabilising war in Yemen, which has killed thousands, made millions homeless, and is creating yet more chaos in which Al-Qaeda can thrive? Why aren't we putting pressure on Turkey over the oil sales and the transit of fighters across their border? Why are we not doing more on refugees? We should be having more refugees, of course we should, here in the UK, but we should also do more in terms of putting pressure on our allies to put more resources into those refugee camps in the region. I appreciate the Prime Minister has done a lot on that. This country has been good on that. Let's make sure that our allies do the same, because those refugee camps are becoming absolutely desperate. It's cold, there's more poverty, there's more desperation, and we can be sure that ISIS will be recruiting in those refugee camps too.
Mr. David